Okay, check one, two, check one, two, testing, testing. Let me know in the chat how the sound is. I am looking forward to the stream tonight. It's not going to be a super long one because I feel like last few have been very, very long. And I want to spend some time with my wife. So, I will be streaming for probably at least an hour, but hopefully not much more than an hour. So please hit the like button. It helps fuel the algorithm. I know I don't know if this is the best topic to do in such a short stream, but we're going to touch on it again. And we've touched on it multiple times in the past if you've been following this channel for quite some time. And I think that it's a very interesting topic. And it's also one that I think, you can do a concise stream on it if, God willing. So we'll see how it goes. But please hit the like button, comment any questions that you have in the live chat, comment any questions that you have below also if you're not watching this live. But if you are, I invite you to participate. I really appreciate it always. And you guys are the reason that I keep coming back every week. And I really appreciate it. So what I want to talk about tonight is the math at the very of creation, essentially. The math at the very, very beginning of the creation of a universe. And this is something that is, discussed quite a bit in physics. And I actually think that it's not discussed correctly usually. And the reason why I say that and why I also might be wrong about that is I don't understand the math that is usually discussed. And it's not even that I don't understand it. It's that it's very complex. And I haven't really made that much of an effort to understand it because I see that it's very complex and I think that that would be wrong. And the reason why is because we're talking about the very first math. The equations to describe the very first actions ever done. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to describe the very first, you could say, math equations that ever have existed. And those are, when people are thinking about the beginning of the universe, they are thinking that the math must be very complicated, usually. And I think that we should assume the opposite. It should be very simple. And I had this kind of an epiphany once years ago. It was probably like 2019, 2020. And I was up listening to a physics podcast very late. It was probably like 2 a.m. And I was sitting there and I was like, what if like you really tried to think about the math at the beginning of the universe? And like, what if I actually thought, just for the sake of argument, that it was possible to understand instead of thinking that it would be so complex? And even physicists, I think that it would be so complex. I think that's an error. But why why not try and assume that it is understandable and simple, and try and just think about this in terms of the context of the actions taking place, and take it from there and see what happens. And one of the things that you have to always assume at the very beyond the beginning, I'll say, is that you're starting from one. That's the number that you're starting from. And we tend to look at this backwards. We look at through telescopes, and we see how far away these star systems are, by judging by light years from us, and then we try and calculate how big the universe is by judging by the distances that we can try and measure in light years. And this is not the right way to go about it. You want to go about it, I think, in a generative way, not in a kind of from the inside looking out way, which is when you're looking at far off distances and measuring, this is the temperature at the very beginning of the Big Bang. It's like, this is the size of the universe at 0.0000000000000 seconds after the Big Bang. This is the temperature 0.000000000 seconds after the Big Bang. That is not what I'm trying to do. I'm not saying that that's not legitimate. I don't know the use of that, but maybe there is a use. I just don't know it, and it's not for me. That, I think, is for someone else. And if that's for anyone, it's for someone else. For people who are more mathematically literate than me. But I think that what I'm trying to do is look at it from the outside in. I took a different approach. Instead of thinking of taking measurements with multi-billion dollar, optical systems that orbit the Earth, I thought about what it would be like tried to think about what it would be like to be God and try and make a universe. And I think that this is actually the right way of thinking about it, going about it, this. And I'm not saying that this is correct, because I will say that even my mind is within God's mind. So I am bound by that constraint, and I cannot see beyond I'm probably cannot see beyond my constraints. I mean, I don't think I can. But trying to be as humble as possible throughout this entire thought process, which is tough, because humility is not the same as being like, I could never do that. I could never think about the math at the beginning of the universe. No, it's about being honest with oneself about oneself, and recognizing that you will have constraints, some of which you probably can see, some of which you probably cannot, and trying to do the best with what you have access to, and be as honest with yourself about yourself as possible, and while also assuming, for the sake of argument, that you can understand something. Because if you don't assume that, then you will never try, and if you do try, it won't be an honest try. And so I sat there and I was like, okay, you know what? I'm going to give this a shot. At 2 a.m. in 2020 on some random night. And I actually think it was extraordinarily simple, which is exactly what I kind of expected after thinking about it. And also what I think what we all should expect when we think about it, actually. Because you're thinking about the creation of the cosmos. Like, you're thinking about the creation of multiplicity itself. So that means that you have to start from one and build from there. And there is no multiplicity beyond the beginning, or at the beginning. Or you could say maybe at the beginning there's two, but this just depends on what you're counting as the beginning. But I'm saying that you have to start from one, obviously. And it's funny, because another thing that I've seen so often is people say, how do you get a universe from nothing? This is a bad question. And the context is wrong. When you think about the context of sentient singularity theory, and you realize that, or you assume that existence is by nature fundamentally sentient, and by structure fundamentally singular, and all that means also initially singular, then this is a context that you can work with. When you say, how do you get everything from nothing? This is the wrong context. You're thinking about things. You're thinking about relativity. You're thinking about space. You're thinking about time. You can't think about pens without thinking about space. This is defined within the boundaries of space. And but you and your you-ness, your sentience, is not. It's beyond space and time. It is beyond space and time. And I mean, to even think about this, somebody asked in the last stream that I had, hopefully I can make this as concise as possible. I really want to just, I want to have this stream, but I also want to just relax with my wife. So somebody said that we were talking about the ship of Theseus, and is the ship of Theseus still the same ship? And this is a bad question. The answer is it's Theseus's ship always, unless he sold it. That's it, or it was stolen. But then somebody applied this to sentience, and they said, I said a better context of this question would be, am I still me even after all my cells have turned over? Because every 10 years or whatever, I don't know the length of time, depends on how old you are, I'm sure. All your cells in your body completely turn over. But there is a point in your life where all the cells, you have no cells left from your initial cells, unless you're a woman. And if you're a woman, then you're born with a certain amount of eggs, and they stay with you forever, unless they're shed, or they turn into a baby. But those are the only cells that stay constant in your body, in anyone's body. And so, at least I think. But we'll assume that's the case. And if that's the case, are you still you, even if 20 years earlier you had a whole separate set of cells that you're made of? And the answer, I think, is yes. Absolutely. It's built into the question. Am I still me? Of course. Think about that question. It answers itself. And these are the best, kind of questions answer themselves. And you don't even have to move beyond it. It's not even like there's a question and an answer. It's like the question answers itself. And this, though, is the context of sentient singularity theory, is this context, sentient context, the second context. Can't remember if that is exactly where I was going with this metaphor, or not metaphor, but this thought. But it was something like that. And but when so but the difference is like one of these contexts is about some ones, and the other one is about something, the ship versus you, the someone, the something versus the someone. And we need to put this into the context of someones when we're thinking about the beginning of the universe. How do you get someone from someone else? It's not how do you get everything from nothing. Things do not matter when we're talking about the beginning of cosmogenesis, which is how do we get multiplicity of sentience from singularity of sentience, from one sentient being? How do we get multiple sentient beings from one sentient being? That's the question. How do we get someone from someone? Right? This is a very different question than how do you get everything from nothing? Everything from nothing is a bad question. There's no answer to that. The context is wrong. The assumption is wrong. You're starting from an empty set. Like, there's nothing that makes sense about that question. There's no point in trying to reconcile it. But how do you get someone from someone? This is a question with constraints that we can think about. And so I started trying to, within this context, map it out. And this is the math that was simple. This doesn't mean that all math is simple. It doesn't mean that it doesn't get complicated. It means that this is the math that was simple. That's it. And what I was hoping for is that what I would see symmetry patterns and quantities, which are really just symmetry patterns. That's all quantities really are. 5 is a symmetry pattern. 4 is a symmetry pattern. 6 is a symmetry pattern. 9 is a symmetry pattern. And each one of these quantities, because of the symmetry pattern that is created by the quantity when it is, arranged, which is, if you've ever done like dot numbers, I don't know if you ever did that to count. It's like, when you're looking at a 4 and you're counting on the paper, it's like 1, 2, 3, 4. I don't know if you've ever done that. Or 9, it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I did that as a kid, and it helped me just calculate math. Now we just ask Siri and ChatGPT if it's really complicated, or you just use Excel like I did. And so this is what I wanted. I was hoping, though, that the quantities and the symmetry patterns would make sense with the symmetry patterns that we'd see in the standard model of physics, and with some of the other models that I had already made in sentient singularity theory. And so they did seem to. But I want to show what those are now. But that's the context that we're dealing with. And what I've said here many times, and I will continue to say it till I am no longer speaking. Context is information. There is no information outside of context. There's no information inside of context. Context is information. You cannot be informed without having context. And so this is a lesson of life in everything, in politics and news, and learning anything in school, and the math at the beginning of the universe. So let's see. Sound is good. Thank you, Nate. Looking good, sounding good. Good. Okay, so this is my matrix that I made. This is a calculative model that is trying to just show the math at the beginning of the creation of multiplicity, of cosmogenesis, I would say. And it's not necessarily the only way to show it. It's just the way that I showed it. Okay? And now I want to talk about more context, more information on what this right here is showing. I want you to imagine that you are God. You are existence itself and sentient. And you want to create you are someone. You are all that exists. There's no one else. There's nothing else. It's just you alone, and you are the universe, or you are existence itself. There's no one outside of you. There's nothing outside of you. There's not even anything inside of you right now either. There's just you. Someone. The only one. The first one. And you want to create another one. A second one. Someone else. How do you do that? Where do you do that? And I guess we can touch on why do you do that, but for now, let's just talk on the kind of the how and the why, how and the where. Short answer to why is meaning, I think. But maybe we'll talk a bit about that tonight, but we've talked about it before this. I talked about it on the last stream quite a bit. But there's nothing outside of you. You are sentient existence. That means that anything outside of existence is non-existent, so doesn't exist. Anyone else that you create has to be within you, cannot be outside you, by just the constraint of you being sentient existence itself. This is a constraint that God has. And you have to work within this constraint. This is a constraint that God appears to have. Okay? I'm trying to be, again, as humble about this as I can be, especially with this kind of thing, because I'm not God. Even though I'm trying to think about what this is like from God's perspective. I'm not God, though. So it's, I can assume, but, that's all we can do. That doesn't mean that it's useless either, especially if it starts to line up, which it does. So you have to partition some of your energy to go towards someone within you. Okay? There's a few different metaphors, kind of close to metaphors, but not necessarily metaphors, or different ways of thinking about this. And such as you are a ball, and you are that ball of sentient existence. You have to create another ball of sentient existence within you. And that means it has to fit inside of you. Okay? It can't be bigger than you. Because then it would expand beyond you, and there's no one beyond you. And it can't be the same size as you either. It has to be contained within you. And there's many different ways to think about this. If you're thinking about this in terms of space, the ball has to fit inside the ball that it's within. Or if you're thinking about this in terms of energy and animation, God is animating, which means he has to have enough, whatever the structure, the system within himself, which is a sentient system, but that he's creating, he has to have enough energy to animate it. It has to be less energy than he has in order to animate. It can't be take more energy to animate than he has, or otherwise it doesn't work. And so these are kind of metaphors, but they're not really. Because, you could kind of say that creation has to super spatially fit within God. And the system, the animated system, has to be able to God has to have enough energy to animate himself and the animated system within him. These are not exactly the most holistic ways of describing this, because what is happening is a sentient being is creating another sentient being within himself. And so what this is, and a sentient being is not just a system, and it's not just a structure. It's a someone, which is a system and a structure and more. And so that's why I have to use multiple kind of metaphors to talk about this. But that, I hope that makes some sense. Comment in the chat if that makes some sense. According theme somehow God retreats from itself to allow for the space in which another can exist, according to Kabbalistic teachings. Yeah, theme some is like it's just a word for kind of for creation in Kabbalistic teaching. I've read a little bit about it, but that's not where I got these ideas either. But I certainly see the parallels, but that's not where I got this. And I'm showing you the math, so that's how you know that I'm being honest. But I've certainly noticed the parallels in the metaphysics that are described, and so in many theological traditions with what I'm about to discuss, which makes sense. I'm not trying to tell you people are wrong. Actually, like I'm not trying to confirm or deny anyone. I'm trying to show you what I have found, and it does line up with, some metaphysical teachings and various theological traditions. So, and I think about this in very similar to like in Star Wars, where, and also even kind of like when you're on an airplane. Maybe here. Okay, let me go to the Star Wars first. In the last Star Wars that they made, oh man, what was that one? The last Star Wars movie that they made, in the series. I'm a huge Star Wars fan, but I did not like the sequels at all. I like the prequels. I don't like the sequels. But in the end, Kylo Ren, and I actually like this one kind of part of this, of the movie, is Rey dies. And Kylo Ren gives his life force to Rey. And earlier in the movie, Rey sees this hurt, injured, like dragon snake under the underground on some planet, and she heals it. And then she's like, oh, I just gave it a little bit of force energy or something, or life force or something. And it was just injured though. But then at the end of the movie, Kylo Ren gives all of his energy to Rey after she dies and brings her back from the dead. And I actually really like that. I thought that was like brilliant. But it was one of the few things that is brilliant in the sequels, but it was brilliant. And it kind of ties it in with things from the prequels. It was good. And it was a good character arc for Kylo Ren. But he can't bring her back to life without giving his entire life. And so this would be the same as if God put all his energy into creation. All of it. And I'm not saying, by the way, there aren't other aspects to creation and that there aren't multiple things happening that are going on that you could describe at once. You definitely can. And this is I'm just describing one thing, one part of this. And so, but that's the same as if you were trying to create a ball within a ball that's the same size as the ball that it's within. Doesn't work. And I tried to create an equation to show this. And so I did right here. Right here, this is an equation that is showing that if this is less than this, that it would return false. Okay, so basically what I'm doing is you're taking 1 and you're dividing it by 1. So the question is what is the product of that, or is the answer to that less than 1? Less than what you started with, essentially. And basically, it's when you it's kind of tough here because it makes more sense to describe something as being cut in half in the next equation here. But basically, if you take all of the energy to start with and you dump it into creation, then you have nothing left over to sustain creation. The end, what you've put into creation is greater than what is left over after the division, which is not even a division. It's kind of just a complete sacrifice. And when I say complete, I mean like total. And what you end up with is you go from 1 to 1. You're left with 1. So there's no multiplicity anymore that's been created. You had 1. And it was God, and he gave all his energy into creation, into creating someone else. That's what it meant, what I mean by that. And so when he did that, now there's creation is left, which is just someone else. And so you're just stuck with one. So you started with one, you've ended with one. What is the point of this? You're not creating multiplicity. And so you go to the next one, same equation basically. But now you're dividing, instead of dividing by one, which you have to start with dividing by one. You have to start with one and start with dividing by one, because that's where you're starting, with one. There is no 2 yet. There is no 3. There is no 4. There, not even conceptually. You have to think about this and in a series of steps. This is kind of like what Stephen Wolfram talks about with computational irreducibility. It's like you have to try one first, at least conceptually. And then you have to try 2, and then you have to try 3, because 3 doesn't even exist yet when you haven't even tried 2. Okay, this isn't our space. This is beyond space, before space, and beyond space. And so, the next thing that you try is 2, because what comes after 1? 2. That's just where you have to go. And so now think about a ball, and you cut the ball in half and you make 2 balls with this, or 2 balloons, whatever. Like you cut a balloon in half, you make 2 balloons. Now what happens? Both balloons are equal size. This doesn't work either, because one balloon can't fit inside the other because they're equal size. What this also means is that it takes the same, another way of thinking about this is it would take the same amount of energy to animate creation as God has. And that's not what you can have. He needs to have more energy left over for himself than it takes to run creation. So basically, it's like, you're going to push something uphill, or push something, or lift something. Like it can't exceed how much you can lift. This is as close as you're going to get to actually thinking about as a logical framing of almost can God create a rock so heavy you can't lift it? It's like, that's a bad question, but can God create someone that doesn't fit within himself, that is not within himself, that is not contained within himself? That's a good way of putting it. Can God create someone else who is not contained within himself? No, he cannot. He cannot, because he is all that exists. There's no one outside him. There's nothing outside him. It's a constraint that he appears to have. And so he has to, it's kind of like what I was getting at earlier, is like when you're on an airplane and they say, you have to put your mask on first, then put your mask on the children next to you. It's because if you pass out, you can't actually assist the child next to you. If God doesn't have enough energy to sustain himself and creation, then he can't sustain creation. So he needs enough energy to animate creation within himself, which really means it has to be containable within him in order to even be creatable. It's not even like, this would destroy him. It's like he couldn't even do it if he wanted to. I don't think. It appears that way. I will just say it appears that way. And so 2 doesn't work either, because you divide 1 by 2, and what do you get? You get 0.5 and 0.5, 50%, 50%. You're looking for one to be greater than the other. That's not happening there. And you're looking for 2 quantities where one is greater than the other. That's not happening. And in the first one, you don't get 2 quantities. You just get 1 quantity. 1 divided by 1 is 1. You don't get 2 quantities. So what do you go to next? Three. You're trying to divide 1 by 3. And what you want is the energy that is left over you want a lopsided answer. So you want what is left over from the division to be less than what you want the answer to be greater than what is left over from the division, or less than what is left over from the division, essentially. So if let's say now you take a balloon and you take 1/3 of it and you roll it up and pinch it off, and now you've got 2, and you put that one balloon inside what's left over from the division. And so now you have a balloon that is 2/3 the size of the original, and a balloon that is 1/3 the size of the original, and the balloon that's 1/3 the size of the original fits inside the balloon that is 2/3 the size of the original. And remember, size doesn't really matter. This is a metaphor. So is God really losing anything? No, he's only gaining in actuality. But multiplication and division are not fundamentally different actions. They are two perspectives of one action. And when you think about a cell dividing, it's doing so to multiply. If I say, how does a cell multiply? Well, by dividing. Okay. What happens when a cell divides? It multiplies. That's, when you think, this is the context of a sentient being. And so it's just two sides, and you can see that very obviously in that example. That's not a metaphor either. That's just an example. And it shows in that example, they are absolutely two perspectives of one action. They are not two separate actions. They are just two perspectives of one action. And that also goes with addition and subtraction on a fundamental level. But it's a little bit more, I guess you could say, different, because there is no kind of subtraction really fundamentally. But if you think about this, and you want to, this is a metaphor. This is not an example. This is a metaphor. The cell is an example, but this cake metaphor is a metaphor where you have a cake and you have two plates. You have one plate, I have one plate. And on my plate is a whole cake. And I want to, you want some cake, and I want to give you some cake. How do I give you some cake? How do I add cake to your plate? By subtracting cake from my plate, because this is the only cake, is the cake that I have. And so the only way to add cake to your plate is to subtract from my plate. And this is kind of a sentient context, but it is kind of an example, but it's not really a fundamental example. It's kind of it's like a metaphor more so than it is an example, but it's also an example. It's not as much of a direct absolute example as the cells. But in this context though, you can see in order to add cake to your plate, I have to subtract from my plate. Two perspectives of one action. And this is kind of in a more absolute context too, because we're talking about all that exists in this metaphor is like, I have all the cake. There is no other cake. You can't go and bake your own cake. You can't go to the store and get more cake. I have all the cake. And if you want some cake, I have to subtract it from my plate to add it to your plate. And so, and that is kind of the context of what we're talking about. We're talking about existence itself. There is nothing outside of existence. We're only talking about fundamental existence. And so God has to put his mask on first, though. And that means, what this kind of means is that he has to create a creation that requires less energy to animate than he is left over after the division. So if it only takes 1/3 of his energy to animate creation, and he has 2/3 of his energy left, he can do it. This is stable. And he can lift it. It can be contained within him. And so it fits within him, just like the balloon. And that's what this is showing. Right here. You can see that these are what is calculated And you can look at these equations and you can kind of break them down. Well, I'm going to do an in-depth video on this. This is kind of just a contextual overview on this stream of this model. But I'm going to do it much more kind of technical, holistic, and detailed also overview of all of the models of sentient singularity theory and what is as best as I even understand them. And you know, I know that might sound a little odd, but I mean, there's always more to understand, even about things that you build. But especially when they reflect things that you didn't build. You know, this isn't something I created. It's a model that I created of something that I did not create, of something someone else created, which is God. And so, you know, that is, it's different. But I did make the model. And so, but that's where all of these quantities, and like I said before, this is not the only way to model this. This is just the way I modeled it. But that's what's basically happening. That's where these quantities are coming from. So basically what you get is God gets with 2/3 of his energy, 0.66666 repeating percent, left with him for creator. And we get 0.33333 repeating 1/3 of the energy with creation. And what's interesting about this symmetry pattern that is found right here is it's a binary triadic pattern. And what I mean by that is that you have creator and creation. This is a binary. But you have a division by 3 happening in order to get these quantities and this structure, which is a binary structure, but the spread, the weightedness is triadic. And this is exactly what we see right here. At the beginning of the chain of sentience, or the periodicity of sentience, as I have within sentient singularity theory, which is, you know, a molecule is an assembly of atoms, an atom is an assembly of hadrons, hadron is, you could say, an assembly of quarks, and a quark is an assembly of information and energy, but really a quark is not actually a sentient being in my model. This is the beginning of sentience, is protons and neutrons. But these are kind of like the fingers of God. But what's interesting about the creation, the very first creation, which is proton or neutron, it's a proton and then a neutron, but is when we're talking about hadrons, is a proton is 2 up quarks and a down quark. This is a binary triadic pattern. 2 up quarks, 1 down quark. There's 2 different types of quarks, but there's a triadic spread where there's 2/3 of the quarks that make up a proton are up quarks, and 1/3 of the quarks that make up a proton is a down quark. And a neutron is the same thing. There's 3 quarks and 2 different types of quarks. So it's binary triadic. There's 2 down quarks and 1 up quark. So 2/3, or 0.66666 repeating, or 66.66 repeating percent of the of a proton, or of a neutron, is composed of down quarks essentially, and 1/3, or 3 repeating, or 33.3 repeating percent of a down quark, of a neutron is an up quark. Sorry, is an up quark. This is the symmetry pattern that is the same symmetry pattern that we see here. And this continues, by the way, everywhere. And, even Calabi-Yau manifold, which is a 6-dimensional manifold at every point in space and time, which is really like, it's a 6-dimensional mental structure of information processing. That's 6 is the number that comes up when you have a binary triadic pattern, which is 2 sets of 3 or 3 sets of 2. 6. And so we're seeing that same symmetry pattern right here, though, right where it should be. It's many other places, but it's also right there at the very beginning of the model. And that's not something I built into it purposely. It's something I expected to see given my assumption about what the periodicity of sentience would be, which is following a nested lineage chain, essentially, of individual and assembly. And then I had an assumption about, what I would expect to see, which is just I would expect to see the symmetry patterns that we see in physics. And they're there. And the math isn't complicated. It's super simple. It's as simple as you could possibly get. We're talking about 1 plus 1 and 1 divided by 3. That's all. Which is exactly what you should expect when we're talking about the math of the metaphysics, or we're talking about the meta-mathematics of cosmogenesis. That's what I should have called this stream. The meta-mathematics of cosmogenesis. That's pretty good. Maybe for the produced video on this topic. But I did produce a video on this topic. It's probably like the 4th video or 5th video uploaded to this channel. You can watch it. It was made years ago, so my language has gotten much more refined since then. The math is the same, but the model's the same, basically. It's not as clean looking, but you can see it. And it's sometimes really interesting to see like people's work as they go. And that's part of what this channel, what was the point of this channel is I want to show people as I go, where I'm at. But I had already made that model when I started the channel, pretty recently before probably about 6-7 months before I started the channel, maybe a bit more. But yeah, you can see, it might be interesting to see how the differences in how I describe things, but you'll get it. If you watch this and you watch that, you'd be like, yeah, it's not changed. But the language has got more refined, certainly since my very first videos. And I was just much rougher with it. But that's to be expected if you're actually making some progress. I mean, the main progress that the greatest progress that I've made with this channel since starting it is in the language I use to describe things, for sure. But I hope that was interesting. I don't want to go really beyond that, because beyond that is to get into other models that we'll talk about on other streams. I'll go to the chat for questions, and we'll probably start wrapping up. Where are we at right now as far as time goes? We're not under an hour, guys. That's pretty good for me. That's really good for me, actually. But we're not ending quite yet, but we'll end pretty soon. If you have any questions that you want me to touch on before we go, please comment them in the chat. And please hit the like button. Really helps fuel the algorithm. If you thought this was interesting, share it. I hope it was concise, and I hope it was coherent. it is, this is partially practice for when I do make another produced video on this, which is coming this year. And that one is, the 2.0 version of the very first one. But there's a lot of interesting math in that first video, but we will get into more. Like there are quantities that when placed into the context of sentient singularity theory have obvious meaning, which is fascinating. Because remember, like I said at the beginning of this, context is information. So, it's where a quantity occurs in a certain context matters. And it's very interesting to see sometimes. But I'm not claiming to understand, the numerology of every number or anything like that. I don't read numerology websites or anything, and I don't think that it's a good idea to go down that road. But it's, it's like, what does 2 symbolize? It's like, well, at first it symbolizes differentiation. That's what it symbolizes. Someone and someone else. Differentiation. You and me. And that's where it first appears, really, like fundamentally, is someone from someone. What does 3 symbolize? I don't know. It symbolizes probably multiple things, but at least generation for sure. And it's interesting because you can see that in this model, and it's like we divide by 3 in order to generate another. And when we think about even the language that we use when we're talking about generations, it's like you, your parent, your grandparent, and it's like parent, child, grandchild. It's like always anything beyond that you add great, and then it's like great, 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 great. And it's kind of more arbitrary. But we have even the way that we think about generations, like, which is us thinking firsthand about generation, is thinking about generations of us. We have it in this triadic way. And, when they say, we see the triality in the standard model of particle physics. You have electron, muon, tau, and, tau, electron, neutrino, tau, neutrino, muon, neutrino, and tau, neutrino, and up quark and charm quark and top quark and down quark and bottom quark and, or beauty quark and bottom quark, something like that. Sometimes they use beauty or down, or it'd be like top and charm, I think. There's one that they change depending on who you. Let's look. It's been years since I've looked. Let's look actually before we wrap up, so I at least touch on this. Charm quark. I've never looked up why sometimes they say charm quark. Or truth quark. They say it's not the charm quark. It's truth quark. Truth quark. Truth quark versus top quark. The top quark, also known as the T quark or truth quark, is an elementary particle. So I guess it's just another. I mean, I know it's another name, but I don't know why they have 2 different names for it. Same thing with bottom and beauty quark, I think. So it's BEUT and bottom. The beauty quark and a bottom quark are the same particle, just different names. Beauty quark is an older, less commonly used term, while bottom quark is a preferred name used by most physicists today. I actually like the term beauty quark and truth quark more. I think that they align more with like a sentient context. But Usually the older way in which we use a term is better. I've talked about this before. It's like species. This is one of the. They used to say the elements were different. Instead of saying the elements, they would say there were 4 elements, and it's like earth, wind, water, and fire. And like then there was the atoms, and there were different species of atoms. They wouldn't say these are the different elements. They would say these are the different species of atoms, and I actually like that. And species in biological context meant, you cannot hybridize or cross. You cannot breed with a member of the different species. So, but now we have arbitrary terms for species based on basically like, does something look? For a while, it was like, does it look like a different species? Does it look like a different animal or not? And then it was like, no. And then it was like subspecies was if it was a different color, but it looked like the same morphology. But if it had a different morphology, it was a different species. But then if it was a different color, it was a different subspecies. And then if it was a different color, but the same morphology, now it's a different species. And now if they look the same, but there's a few differences in the genetics when we actually examine the genetics, then now it's a different species. And it's just ridiculous. I think that's as arbitrary. It's just as arbitrary as you could get. But the older definitions, my point is, usually like are more absolute and I think closer to truth, like truth quark. But let's see. Maybe God's thoughts were always sentient, and this creation is a way of those thoughts to experience individuality. I think that's there's a truth to that, I will say. We are in God's mind. I will say that. I don't know if we are God's thoughts is the best way of putting it, but we certainly are, but we're also more than that. But we also are that. I'm not saying God doesn't have sentient and non-sentient thoughts. I think probably. But he at least has sentient thoughts, which means thoughts being information structures within a mind, and we are information structures inside God's mind. So if that's the definition of a thought, then we are a thought. There are other definitions of thoughts which we should try not to be. But the scale has only 2 choices, right? 2 cell of 1 action. I don't know what you mean by that, but yes, there's only fundamentally there's always a binary decision, always in choices, and there's never a more. Whenever you're making a choice, your mind divides the choice into 2. If you have lots of different options, then it makes a series of binary choices to narrow it down. It doesn't just make the choice from the multiplicity beyond 2. It's the ratio of spiritual consent as the metaphor. I don't know what that means. So to add weight spiritually, I have to give others the right to rule over and hold you spiritually accountable for their oppressive actions and atrocities, regardless of faith analogy. I don't know what you mean. To add weight spiritually, I have to give others the right to rule over and hold you accountable. Hold who accountable? You? I don't know what you're trying to say. Exactly. Maybe try rewording it. I see. Thank you. Okay, good. I don't know what I answered, but I hope it seems like I answered it. What about the zygote? Doesn't relativity show us that there is no size of measuring to the God element? Small could be extremely large. If there's no size, then to say small could be extremely large doesn't even matter. We shouldn't even be saying small or large or anything like that. Beyond size, beyond relativity, we shouldn't even be saying size terms unless you're just making some type of metaphor, but recognizing that it's a metaphor. I don't know what you mean by what about the zygote. I don't know what about it. Doesn't relativity show what what is a God element? I don't know what that means. Infinity is amazing. Infinity is amazing, but it's also very simple. And I hear like Lex Friedman's was always asking this for a while. He was like, "What do you think about infinity?" Like, it just blows my mind that we can even like some people can even conceptualize of infinity. That is infinity is not a difficult thing to think about. Infinity is tough to think about. It's not tough. It is impossible to conceive of infinity in a relativistic context because it doesn't make sense. It's like contextual. It's contextless, which it means like there's really nothing there. It's not that it's so hard to think about in a relativistic context. I don't even know if that's the best way of describing what I'm trying to explain, but it's that you can't think about it. And but when you're thinking about someone's sentient someone's, what infinity means, and this is what I think is the only definition of infinity that makes sense because it's the only definition of infinity that would have a definition that is unique and also true, meaning like actually representative of describing of something that exists, which is when you have someone and infinite someones come after that. Basically, starting with what this really means is start with one, adding infinitely. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, on and on, infinitely. That's infinity. That's it. And that's not actually complicated. It's just starting from one, growth. That's it. It just means infinite growth or generativity. Like it just means continuous generativity. That's it. Within really, I mean, more fundamentally, especially like within the context of like sentience or fundamentality. It's just continuous generativity. It's not complicated. Eternity means beyond space and time. Like, meaning like always existed, always will exist, currently exists. Like, that's it. Eternity has no beginning and no end. And infinity has a beginning and no end. That's kind of the best way of thinking about it. Is like eternity, no beginning, and no end. Infinity, beginning, no end. But there is a beginning. That's what infinity kind of is. And if you think about it like that, it's actually a super simple concept. It's a concept that we consider all the time. It's not actually like like mind blowing as like people think it is. They think it's like not conceivable. It's like, yeah, you can, as a concept, it's actually very conceivable. It's just we don't normally have a good definition, and so of course, like it seems like it's way beyond reach of your thoughts because like you don't have a good definition. But if you just think about it as has a beginning, no end, infinity. Okay, beginning, no end. Eternity, no beginning, no end, always existed. Always exists. It's a better way of putting that. Always exists. Eternity always exists. Um, nice haircut. Thank you. I really needed a haircut. Definitely did. It's always nice. I hate getting a haircut so much. I go to like sport clips, super cuts, great clips. Like, I don't know what the difference is between them. I don't even pay attention to the names. I couldn't even tell you where I go. It's one of those. And I just always find, whichever one is the closest to where I'm at that moment of one of those three. And that's where I go. And I don't like doing it. I just feel so like it's just so much. You're just sitting there with small talk and you can't move and you can't do anything else while you're sitting there, and it's just a frustrating experience for me all around. My wife is always like, why don't you go to like one of the nice places, and they'll like give you a scalp massage, and I don't know what else they do. Like, and I'm like, that's not where the value is for me though. Like the value is not about like how pleasant the experience can be. The value for me is quick and decent enough. Like that's my value with a haircut. And but I always feel great after I get a haircut. Now, when I was actually a little kid, I was like autistic about haircuts. Like I emotional damage after I got a haircut every single time. I was a weird kid. I like was, it was challenging for me to like switch from jeans to shorts from summer to winter. That was like emotional damage for me every single year for a few years of my life. Same with haircuts. But now I'm just like, I still don't like haircuts, but not because of that. I could actually care less about like, if they give me a bad haircut, it's like, okay, whatever, it will grow back at least for now. But I just like to get it over with. But thank you. I don't know why any of you needed to know that, but now you do. All right. Well, please hit the like button. I hope this was interesting. And I appreciate everybody who tuned in. The last couple streams have been extremely long, over 4 hours. So I wanted to do a short one and then go and spend some time with my wife. So I will call it, but thank you again. And if you have any other questions, please comment them in the chat. Please share this if with anybody who you think might find it also interesting, and hit the like button. Really helps.